In the world of military hierarchy, respect is earned through blood, sweat, and years of dedication. But what happens when the person you've been overlooking, dismissing, or worse, planning to humiliate, turns out to hold the highest rank in the room? This is the story of Sarah Chen, a woman whose quiet strength and hidden authority would teach a group of arrogant cadets the most important lesson of their military careers. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose not to show their power until the moment demands it. And sometimes, that moment comes when you least expect it, at a promotion party where everything you thought you knew about hierarchy gets turned completely upside down. The promotion party at Fort Henderson was in full swing when Sarah Chen walked through the doors of the Officers' Club. The 34-year-old woman moved with quiet confidence, her simple black dress understated among the sea of dress uniforms and cocktail attire. Most people in the room didn't notice her arrival, which was exactly how she preferred it. Sarah had spent the last 15 years of her life in military service, climbing ranks through a combination of exceptional strategic thinking, unwavering dedication, and an ability to remain calm under the most intense pressure. Tonight, she was attending the promotion ceremony for several junior officers, including some cadets who had recently graduated from the military academy. As she made her way to the bar, Sarah observed the room with the trained eye of someone accustomed to reading situations and people. The newly promoted lieutenants were gathered in one corner, their brass buttons gleaming under the chandeliers, their voices loud with the confidence that comes from fresh achievement. Among them stood 3 cadets who had caught her attention during their final training exercises several months ago, though not for reasons they would be proud of. Marcus Webb, the tall blonde with the movie star smile, had a reputation for believing his charm could get him through any situation. His family's military connections had opened doors throughout his career, and he had never learned the value of true humility. Standing next to him was Derek Morrison, whose academic achievements at the academy had inflated his ego to dangerous proportions. He spoke with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been truly challenged. The third member of their group, Tony Rixai, was shorter but compensated with aggressive posturing and a tendency to pick on anyone he perceived as weaker. Sarah ordered a simple club soda with lime and found a quiet spot near the wall where she could observe without drawing attention. She had learned long ago that the most valuable information came from watching people when they thought no one important was looking. The 3 cadets were already several drinks in, their voices growing louder and their behavior more reckless with each passing hour. Sarah noticed how they interacted with the serving staff, dismissing the waiters with barely concealed contempt and making inappropriate comments to the female servers. Their sense of entitlement radiated from them like heat from a furnace. Captain Rodriguez, the officer in charge of tonight's ceremony, approached the microphone to begin the formal portion of the evening. The room gradually quieted as he began calling forward the newly promoted officers to receive their commendations and new rank insignia. During the ceremony, Sarah noticed how the 3 cadets whispered among themselves, making jokes and showing little respect for the solemnity of the occasion. When Captain Rodriguez mentioned that they had special guests in attendance, including distinguished officers who preferred to remain unnamed, Marcus Webb rolled his eyes dramatically. "Probably some old-timers trying to relive their glory days," he muttered to his companions, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. Sarah remained impassive, though she filed the comment away in her memory. She had encountered many young officers like these 3 throughout her career. Some learned humility through experience and became exceptional leaders. Others remained trapped by their arrogance until it ultimately destroyed their careers. After the formal ceremony concluded, the party shifted into a more casual mode. The music grew louder, the drinks flowed more freely, and the atmosphere became increasingly relaxed. Sarah continued her quiet observation, occasionally engaging in brief, polite conversations with other guests who recognized her despite her civilian attire. It was during one of these conversations with Colonel Martinez, an old friend from her early days in intelligence, that she first heard Marcus Webb's voice rise above the general din of the party. "I'm telling you guys, this whole evening has been a joke," he was saying to a growing circle of junior officers. "Half these people don't deserve the ranks they're wearing. The military has gotten soft, promoting people based on politics instead of real ability." Derek Morrison nodded sagely, as if he possessed decades of military wisdom instead of barely 6 months of active duty. It's all about connections now. Look at some of these female officers. They probably never saw real combat but got promoted because the brass wants to look progressive. Tony Rixai, emboldened by alcohol and the attention of his audience, decided to escalate the conversation. Speaking of which, did you guys see that Asian woman over there in the black dress? She's been nursing the same drink all night, probably trying to network her way into some position she doesn't deserve. Sarah's conversation with Colonel Martinez paused as they both overheard the increasingly loud and inappropriate comments. Martinez glanced at Sarah with raised eyebrows, knowing full well who she was and what she had accomplished throughout her distinguished career. "Should I handle this?" Martinez asked quietly. Sarah shook her head almost imperceptibly. "Let's see how far they're willing to take this," she replied, her voice calm but her eyes sharp with interest. The three cadets, now the center of attention among a group of about 15 junior officers, seemed to be feeding off the energy of their audience. Marcus Webb, in particular, appeared to be working himself up to something bigger. "You know what really bothers me?" Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the room. "These diversity hires come in here thinking they're hot stuff, but they've never earned anything through real merit. They hide behind their gender or their ethnicity instead of proving themselves through actual performance." The room was beginning to take notice of the disturbance. Conversations grew quieter as more people turned to listen to the increasingly inflammatory rhetoric coming from the corner where the cadets held court. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression neutral, but those who knew her well would have recognized the subtle tension in her posture that indicated she was preparing for action. Colonel Martinez shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly wanting to intervene before the situation escalated further. Derek Morrison, perhaps sensing that he needed to match his friend's boldness, decided to add his own contribution to the conversation. "The worst part is how they act all superior, like they've accomplished something special. I bet half of them got their positions through quotas rather than actual qualifications." "Exactly," Tony Rixai chimed in, his voice slightly slurred from alcohol. "And then they have the nerve to show up at events like this, probably hopping to schmooze their way into even better positions they don't deserve." The comments were becoming increasingly hostile and inappropriate, and Sarah could see several senior officers in the room beginning to look uncomfortable. She also noticed that some of the other guests, particularly the female officers present, were clearly disturbed by what they were hearing. Captain Rodriguez, who had been mingling with guests on the other side of the room, finally became aware of the disruption and began making his way toward the group of cadets. His expression showed a mixture of concern and growing anger as he caught snippets of their conversation. But before Rodriguez could reach them, Marcus Webb made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of the evening. He had noticed Sarah standing quietly near the wall, still engaged in conversation with Colonel Martinez, and something about her calm demeanor seemed to irritate him. "You know what?" Marcus announced to his audience, his voice now loud enough to be heard clearly across most of the room. "I think it's time someone called out this nonsense. See that woman over there? The one in the black dress who's been lurking around all evening." All eyes in the immediate area turned toward Sarah, who continued to maintain her composed expression despite the sudden attention. She took a small sip of her club soda and waited to see what would happen next. "I bet she's exactly the type of person I'm talking about," Marcus continued, his confidence growing as he mistook Sarah's calm reaction for weakness or fear. "Probably got promoted way beyond her abilities, and now she's here trying to network her way into an even better position." Derek Morrison and Tony Rixai exchanged glances, both sensing that their friend was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But the alcohol and the attention of their audience proved stronger than their better judgment. "Maybe someone should go over there and explain to her how real military hierarchy works," Tony suggested with a nasty grin. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in Marcus Webb's mind. She had observed enough situations like this to know that young men, particularly those with inflated egos and insufficient experience, often made poor decisions when they felt they had an audience to impress. Colonel Martinez stepped slightly closer to Sarah, his protective instincts activated by the increasingly hostile tone of the conversation. "Sarah, maybe we should," he began quietly. But Sarah raised her hand almost imperceptibly, stopping him mid-sentence. Her expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was far from defenseless or concerned about the situation developing across the room. "Let's see what they do next," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of curiosity rather than fear. The tension in the room continued to build as more people became aware of the confrontation brewing between the group of cadets and the quiet woman in the black dress. Some guests began to move away from the potential conflict, while others seemed drawn by the drama unfolding before them. Captain Rodriguez was still making his way through the crowd, but the room was packed and his progress was slow. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb seemed to be working up the courage to make good on his implied threat. Sarah remained exactly where she was, projecting an aura of complete calm that seemed to confuse and further irritate the cadets. Her military training had taught her the value of patience and the power of letting your opponents reveal their true nature before taking action. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach everyone in the room an unforgettable lesson about assumptions, respect, and the danger of underestimating those who choose to wield their power quietly rather than loudly. Marcus Webb drained the rest of his drink and set the glass down with more force than necessary. The alcohol had stripped away whatever restraint he might have possessed, and the encouraging murmurs from his audience had convinced him that he was about to become the hero of some twisted story he could tell for years to come. "You know what, guys? I think it's time someone taught that woman a lesson about her place," Marcus announced, straightening his uniform jacket and running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "She's been standing there all night looking smug, probably thinking she's better than everyone else." Derek Morrison felt a flutter of unease in his stomach, though he couldn't quite identify why. Something about the woman's complete lack of reaction to their increasingly loud comments struck him as unusual. Most people would have either left the area or shown some sign of distress by now. Instead, she remained perfectly composed, occasionally nodding at something her companion was saying, as if she were completely unaware of their presence. "Maybe we should just leave her alone, Marcus," Derek suggested half-heartedly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Are you kidding me?" Tony Rixa interjected, his face flushed with alcohol and excitement. "Webb's right. Someone needs to put these people in their place. The military's got too soft, letting people think they can just waltz in here and act like they own the place." The circle of junior officers around them had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle and the promise of drama. Some looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, but peer pressure and curiosity kept them from walking away. A few seemed genuinely excited by the prospect of confrontation. Sarah continued her conversation with Colonel Martinez, though she was acutely aware of every word being spoken across the room. Her years in intelligence had trained her to process multiple streams of information simultaneously while maintaining the appearance of casual engagement. "They're really going to do something stupid, aren't they?" Martinez asked quietly, his concern evident in his voice. "Oh, I think we can count on it," Sarah replied with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "The question is just how far they're willing to go." Martinez shook his head in disbelief. "These kids have no idea what they're walking into." "No," Sarah agreed, "they really don't." Across the room, Marcus Webb had made his decision. He began walking towards Sarah with the confident stride of someone who believed he was about to right a great wrong. His two friends followed slightly behind, and about half of their audience trailed along to witness whatever was about to unfold. The room seemed to sense the approaching confrontation. Conversations gradually died down as more people noticed the group of young officers making their way across the floor with obvious purpose. The music continued playing, but somehow it seemed to fade into background noise as the tension in the air became almost palpable. Captain Rodriguez, who had finally managed to work his way through the crowd, suddenly realized what was happening. His eyes widened as he saw Marcus Webb approaching Sarah Chen, and he quickened his pace, knowing he needed to intervene before disaster struck. But Marcus was moving faster than Rodriguez could navigate through the crowded room, and he reached Sarah before the captain could stop him. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice carrying the artificial politeness that barely concealed hostility. "I couldn't help but notice you've been standing here all evening, and I thought maybe you might need someone to explain how things work around here." Sarah turned to face him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the evening. Up close, Marcus could see that she was older than he had initially thought, probably in her mid-30s, with intelligent, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything in return. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've been introduced," Sarah said politely, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Chen." Marcus looked at her hand for a moment, but didn't take it, a deliberate slight that drew uncomfortable murmurs from the growing crowd of observers. "Marcus Webb," he replied curtly. "Recently graduated from the academy, and I have to say, I'm not impressed with the kind of people they're letting into military events these days." The insult hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Several people in the crowd gasped audibly, while others shifted uncomfortably. Colonel Martinez stepped forward slightly, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary, though Sarah's almost imperceptible shake of her head kept him from taking immediate action. "I see," Sarah said, her tone remaining perfectly neutral. "And what exactly is it about me that concerns you, Cadet Webb?" The use of his correct rank, rather than the lieutenant bars he wore, was subtle but pointed. Marcus either didn't notice or chose to ignore the implication. "Well, for starters, you're here in civilian clothes at a military promotion ceremony, which shows a lack of respect for the occasion," Marcus began, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "And you've been standing around all evening obviously trying to network your way into positions you probably don't deserve." Derek Morrison and Tony Rixai flanked Marcus, their presence meant to intimidate, though both men were beginning to feel increasingly uncomfortable with their friend's approach. Something about Sarah's complete lack of fear or anger was unsettling in a way they couldn't quite understand. "I see you've given this a lot of thought," Sarah replied calmly. "What else concerns you?" Marcus seemed surprised by her lack of defensive reaction. In his experience, when confronted aggressively, people either fought back or backed down. Sarah was doing neither, and it threw him off his script. "Look, lady, I don't know what game you're playing, but it's not going to work," Marcus said, his frustration beginning to show. "The military is supposed to be about merit and earned respect, not about political correctness and diversity quotas." The crowd around them had grown larger, and Sarah could see Captain Rodriguez pushing through the outer edges, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. She also noticed several other senior officers she recognized working their way toward the confrontation, all wearing expressions of concern and growing anger. "That's an interesting perspective," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Tell me, what makes you think I haven't earned my place here through merit?" "Come on," Tony Rix interjected, emboldened by what he perceived as Marcus's dominance in the exchange. "It's obvious. You're here dressed like you're going to a cocktail party instead of showing proper military bearing. You don't even have the courtesy to wear a uniform to honor the people being promoted tonight." Derek Morrison nodded in agreement, though something in Sarah's expression was making him increasingly nervous. "Plus, you've been lurking around all evening instead of properly introducing yourself to the ranking officers. It's clear you don't understand military protocol." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering their points with genuine interest. "You raise some valid concerns about protocol," she said. "Perhaps I should have been more formal in my approach this evening." Marcus Webb interpreted her calm response as weakness and decided to press his advantage. The alcohol and adrenaline had convinced him that he was winning this confrontation, and the attention of the crowd spurred him toward even more reckless behavior. "Exactly," he said, stepping closer to Sarah in an obvious attempt to use his height and physical presence to intimidate her. "Maybe it's time you learned how real military hierarchy works. When you're in the presence of officers who have actually earned their positions, you show proper respect." "I think that's excellent advice," Sarah replied, her voice still perfectly level. "Respect for hierarchy is absolutely fundamental to military order." Captain Rodriguez had finally reached the inner circle of observers, but the crowd was now 3 people deep in all directions, making it difficult for him to push through to the center of the confrontation. He could hear Marcus Webb's increasingly aggressive tone and see Sarah's unnaturally calm responses, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that disaster was imminent. "Rodriguez to anyone near the bar," he spoke quietly into his radio. "I need immediate assistance breaking up a situation near the north wall." But even as he called for backup, Rodriguez knew that events were unfolding too quickly for outside intervention to prevent whatever was about to happen. Marcus Webb, encouraged by what he saw as Sarah's submission, decided to escalate the confrontation to its ultimate conclusion. He had come this far, and backing down now would make him look weak in front of all the people who had gathered to watch. "You know what I think," Marcus announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "I think you need to learn some real respect. Maybe a little physical reminder of where you stand in the military hierarchy would help you remember your place." The threat was unmistakable, and a collective gasp went up from the crowd. Several people began backing away, sensing that the situation was about to cross a line from verbal confrontation into something much more serious. Derek Morrison grabbed Marcus's arm, finally finding the courage to try to stop his friend before he did something irreversible. "Marcus, maybe we should." "Get your hand off me," Marcus snapped, shaking off Derek's grip. "This woman needs to learn her lesson, and since no one else seems willing to teach it to her, I guess it's up to us." Sarah stood completely still, her expression unchanged, as Marcus raised his hand as if to slap her. The movement was deliberate and slow, designed to maximize the humiliation and give her time to flinch or beg or do something that would satisfy his need to dominate the situation. But instead of fear or anger, Sarah's eyes held something else entirely. There was a quality of patience in her gaze, as if she were waiting for exactly this moment to arrive. It was the expression of someone who had been anticipating this outcome and was finally ready to act. The room held its breath as Marcus's hand reached the peak of its arc, poised to deliver what he believed would be the defining moment of his evening. Every eye in the immediate area was focused on the confrontation, waiting to see what would happen when the entitled young officer's hand met the quiet woman's face. But just as Marcus began to bring his hand forward, a voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Cadet Webb," the voice was sharp, authoritative, and carried the unmistakable ring of absolute command authority. "Stand down immediately." Marcus froze with his hand still raised, confusion replacing confidence on his face as he turned to locate the source of the interruption. The voice had come from behind the crowd, but its power was such that everyone in the immediate area instinctively began making way for whoever had spoken. The voice belonged to Captain Rodriguez, who had finally managed to push through the crowd and now stood directly behind Marcus Webb. His face was flushed with exertion and anger, and his usually calm demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled fury. "What in the hell do you think you're doing, cadet?" Rodriguez demanded, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years of military service and absolute bewilderment at what he was witnessing. Marcus slowly lowered his hand, confusion replacing the aggressive confidence that had driven him moments before. The interruption had broken his momentum, and suddenly he was acutely aware of how many people were staring at him. "Captain Rodriguez," Marcus said, attempting to regain his composure. "I was just trying to teach this woman about proper military protocol she's been disrespecting." "You were about to assault a guest at an official military function," Rodriguez cut him off sharply. "In front of 50 witnesses, have you completely lost your mind?" The reality of what he had almost done began to sink in, but Marcus's pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Sir, with all due respect, this woman has been showing disrespect for military hierarchy all evening. Someone needed to address her inappropriate behavior." Rodriguez looked from Marcus to Sarah, who remained perfectly composed despite having been moments away from being struck. Something in her calm expression reminded him that there were still pieces of this puzzle he didn't understand. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said to Sarah, his tone shifting to professional courtesy, "I apologize for this completely unacceptable behavior. These cadets will be dealt with appropriately." "Thank you, Captain," Sarah replied calmly. "Though I think there might be some value in allowing Cadet Webb to finish explaining his concerns about military hierarchy. It's clearly something he feels strongly about." Rodriguez stared at her in surprise. Most people who had just been threatened with physical assault would want to see immediate consequences for their attackers. Sarah's suggestion that the conversation continue seemed almost surreal. Marcus, interpreting her response as further evidence of weakness, decided to press forward. The alcohol and adrenaline in his system, combined with the presence of his audience, convinced him that he still held the moral high ground. "See," Marcus said to Rodriguez, "she doesn't even understand that what she's doing is wrong. She probably thinks she can just charm her way out of this situation like she's charmed her way into whatever position she currently holds." Derek Morrison and Tony Rixai exchanged increasingly worried glances. The situation had escalated far beyond what they had anticipated, and Captain Rodriguez's presence meant that official consequences were now inevitable. But Marcus seemed determined to dig himself deeper into trouble. "That's enough," Rodriguez said firmly. "All three of you are going to come with me right now, and we're going to have a very serious conversation about conduct unbecoming and—" "Actually, Captain," Sarah interrupted gently, "if you don't mind, I'd like to hear what else Cadet Webb has to say about military hierarchy. His perspective is quite interesting." The crowd around them had grown larger still, and Sarah was aware that word of the confrontation was spreading throughout the party. She could see several more senior officers making their way toward the disturbance, including some faces she recognized from the Pentagon. Marcus looked from Sarah to Rodriguez and back again, unsure how to interpret this unexpected turn of events. But his fundamental arrogance overcame his confusion, and he decided to treat Sarah's request as an invitation to continue his lecture. "Fine," Marcus said, straightening his uniform jacket. "Since you asked, I think the problem with today's military is that people get promoted based on politics instead of merit. Real military leaders earn their positions through combat experience, strategic thinking, and proven performance under pressure." "Those are certainly important qualities," Sarah agreed. "What kind of combat experience do you have, Cadet Webb?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "Well, I haven't been deployed yet, but I graduated at the top of my class in tactical studies, and—" "So no actual combat experience," Sarah clarified gently. "What about strategic thinking? Can you tell me about a complex strategic problem you've solved?" Marcus felt the conversation slipping away from him, but he pressed on. "During our final exercise at the academy, I led my unit to victory in a simulated battle scenario that—" "A simulation," Sarah noted, "and the proven performance under pressure." "I've excelled in every high-pressure situation I've been placed in," Marcus replied, though his voice was beginning to lose some of its earlier confidence. "Such as?" Sarah asked. The simple question hung in the air, and Marcus realized he didn't have a good answer. His military career consisted entirely of academic achievements and training exercises. He had never been tested in any real-world situation that would qualify as genuine pressure by military standards. Captain Rodriguez watched this exchange with growing fascination. Sarah's calm, methodical questioning was systematically dismantling Marcus's arguments without ever raising her voice or showing the slightest sign of anger. It was a masterful display of how to handle an aggressive confrontation, and Rodriguez found himself wondering who exactly this woman was. "I see," Sarah said when Marcus failed to provide specific examples. "So when you talk about people earning their positions through merit rather than politics, you're speaking from your extensive experience in combat, strategic planning, and high-pressure situations." "Look, lady, I don't have to justify myself to you," Marcus snapped, his frustration boiling over as he realized he was being intellectually outmaneuvered. "The point is that people like you don't belong in positions of military authority." "People like me," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "Can you be more specific about what you mean by that?" The question was a trap, and everyone in the crowd could sense it. If Marcus answered honestly, he would have to admit that his objections were based on Sarah's gender and ethnicity rather than any assessment of her qualifications. If he tried to dodge the question, he would look weak and evasive. "You know what I mean," Marcus said, attempting to deflect. "Actually, I don't," Sarah replied. "I'd like you to explain it to me." Tony Rixai, sensing that his friend was losing ground rapidly, decided to jump in with support. "What Marcus is trying to say is that the military has become too focused on diversity instead of finding the best qualified people for leadership positions." "I see," Sarah said, turning her attention to Tony. "And what qualifications do you think are most important for military leadership?" "Experience, proven results, and the respect of the troops," Tony replied, pleased to have what seemed like a straightforward answer. "Those are excellent points," Sarah agreed. "How much military experience do you have, Cadet Rixai?" "I'm just starting my career, but—" "And what proven results can you point to?" "Well, like Marcus, I performed well in all our training exercises." "Training exercises," Sarah repeated. "And do you currently command troops who could demonstrate their respect for your leadership?" Tony's face began to redden as he realized he was being led down the same path as Marcus. Look, we might be new, but we understand military values better than people who got their positions through affirmative action. The comment drew audible gasps from several people in the crowd. Even in his alcohol-influenced state, Tony immediately realized he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. That's it. All three of you are under arrest for conduct unbecoming, public intoxication, and harassment of a guest at an official function. Wait, Derek Morrison spoke up for the first time in several minutes. Something about the entire situation was bothering him, and he needed to understand what was happening before things went any further. Ma'am, can I ask you a question? Sarah nodded encouragingly. You've been incredibly calm through this whole thing, Derek said. Most people would be upset or angry if someone threatened to hit them. You're acting like you expected this to happen. Why is that? It was the first intelligent question any of the three cadets had asked all evening, and Sarah smiled slightly in acknowledgement of Derek's perceptiveness. That's a very good question, Cadet Morrison, she said. The answer is that I've encountered situations like this many times throughout my career. When you've spent enough time in the military, you learn to recognize certain patterns of behavior. What kind of patterns? Derek asked. The pattern of young officers who mistake arrogance for confidence, who confuse loudness with authority, and who assume they can judge someone's qualifications based on superficial characteristics rather than actual performance. Marcus, who had been momentarily subdued by Captain Rodriguez's threat of arrest, felt his anger flare again. You're really enjoying this, aren't you? Acting all superior and wise when everyone can see you're just trying to make us look bad. Actually, Sarah replied, I'm trying to help you learn something important before you make a mistake that could end your military careers. Learn what? Marcus demanded. That assumptions can be dangerous, Sarah said simply, especially assumptions about people you know nothing about. By this point, the commotion had attracted the attention of nearly everyone at the party. The music had been turned down, and the crowd of observers now included most of the senior officers present at the event. Sarah was aware that several of them were trying to get closer to see what was happening, and she knew that the revelation she was about to provide would be witnessed by a significant portion of Fort Henderson's command structure. Captain Rodriguez, who had been growing increasingly curious about Sarah's identity throughout the confrontation, decided it was time to get some answers. Ma'am, he said formally, I think it would be helpful if you could identify yourself for the record. These cadets are going to be facing disciplinary action, and I need to document exactly what occurred here tonight. Sarah nodded and reached into her small evening purse. Marcus, Derek, and Tony watched as she withdrew what appeared to be a military identification card and handed it to Captain Rodriguez. Rodriguez looked down at the ID, and his expression immediately changed from curiosity to shock. His eyes widened as he read the information on the card, then looked up at Sarah, then back down at the card again. Holy, he began, then caught himself and straightened to attention. The change in Rodriguez's demeanor was so dramatic that everyone in the immediate area could sense something significant had just been revealed. The three cadets looked from the captain to Sarah and back again, confusion replacing their earlier confidence. Is there a problem, Captain? Marcus asked, though his voice had lost much of its earlier aggressiveness. Rodriguez looked at Sarah, who gave him a slight nod of permission, then turned to face the three cadets who had spent the evening insulting and threatening one of the most decorated officers in the United States military. Gentlemen, Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction, I'd like you to meet General Sarah Chen, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and 3 Bronze Stars. She's currently the youngest 4-star general in the United States Army and serves as Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence. The words hit the three cadets like physical blows. Marcus's face went white, Derek's mouth fell open, and Tony actually took a step backward as the full magnitude of their mistake became clear. The crowd around them erupted in murmurs of amazement and disbelief. Several junior officers who had been watching the confrontation unfold immediately came to attention, while others looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. But Sarah herself remained exactly as calm and composed as she had throughout the entire evening, as if being revealed as one of the most powerful people in the room was just another ordinary occurrence. The silence that followed Captain Rodriguez's announcement was deafening. In a room that had been filled with conversation and laughter just moments before, the only sounds were the distant music from the speakers and the collective intake of breath from dozens of witnesses who had just realized they had watched 3 cadets threaten to assault a 4-star general. Marcus Webb felt his knees go weak as the full implications of what had just been revealed crashed over him like a tsunami. The woman he had been insulting, threatening, and lecturing about military hierarchy was not only a general, but one of the most decorated officers in the entire United States Army. His mind raced through every word he had spoken during the confrontation, and each memory made him feel sicker than the last. Derek Morrison was staring at Sarah with a mixture of horror and fascination, his analytical mind trying to process how completely wrong his assumptions had been. The woman they had dismissed as an unqualified diversity hire was actually someone whose military achievements far exceeded anything any of them could ever hope to accomplish. Tony Rixai looked like he was going to be physically ill. His face had gone from red to green, and he was swaying slightly on his feet as the alcohol and shock combined to overwhelm his system. The comments he had made about affirmative action and unqualified promotions now seemed not just wrong but monumentally stupid. Sarah observed their reactions with the same calm attention she had maintained throughout the evening. She had seen this kind of shock before when young officers discovered that their assumptions about her were wildly inaccurate, but rarely had the revelation been quite so dramatic. Captain Rodriguez was still holding her identification card, looking from it to her face as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "General, I had no idea you were attending tonight's ceremony. If I had known." "You would have done exactly what you did," Sarah interrupted gently. "You saw inappropriate behavior and you intervened to stop it. That's exactly what a good officer should do." The crowd around them had grown larger still as word of the revelation spread throughout the party. Senior officers who had been across the room were now pushing through the crowd to see what was happening, and junior officers who had been laughing and drinking were suddenly trying to make themselves invisible. Among the new arrivals was Brigadier General Patterson, the commanding officer of Fort Henderson, who had been in a private meeting during the early part of the confrontation, but had been summoned by urgent messages from his staff. He approached the group with quick, purposeful strides, his expression serious. "General Chen," Patterson said, coming to attention and offering a crisp salute. "I apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced this evening. I was not aware you were attending our ceremony." Sarah returned the salute casually. "No inconvenience at all, General Patterson. Actually, this has been quite educational." Patterson's eyes swept over the 3 cadets, taking in their pale faces and obvious distress, then moved to Captain Rodriguez, who was still holding Sarah's identification. "Captain, perhaps you could brief me on what occurred here," Patterson said, his tone making it clear that he expected a full and accurate report. Rodriguez straightened to attention. "Sir, these 3 cadets were making inappropriate comments about diversity in the military and specifically targeting General Chen with harassment and threats. Cadet Webb was in the process of attempting to physically assault the general when I intervened." Patterson's expression grew darker with each word of the report. He turned to look at Marcus, Derek, and Tony, his gaze making each of them feel like they wanted to sink through the floor. "Is this accurate?" Patterson asked the 3 cadets. Marcus tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt like it was filled with sand, and his mind was completely blank. The confident young officer who had been holding court just minutes before had been replaced by a terrified cadet who suddenly understood that his military career might be over before it had truly begun. Derek found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sir, we didn't know." "You didn't know what?" Patterson interrupted sharply. "You didn't know that threatening to assault anyone at a military function was completely inappropriate. You didn't know that harassment based on gender or ethnicity is against everything the military stands for. Exactly what part of this did you not know?" "We didn't know she was a general," Tony blurted out, then immediately realized how pathetic that sounded as an excuse. Patterson stared at him for a long moment. "So you're telling me that your behavior would have been acceptable if General Chen had been a private, or a civilian? Your conduct is only inappropriate because she outranks you." The question hung in the air like an accusation, because all 3 cadets realized that was exactly what they were implying. They had assumed it was acceptable to threaten and harass someone they perceived as inferior, and they were only horrified now because they had discovered their target was actually their superior. Sarah had been watching this exchange with interest, but now she decided to intervene before the situation escalated further. "General Patterson," she said calmly, "if I might make a suggestion." "Of course, General." "I think there might be more educational value in continuing this conversation than in simply ending it with disciplinary action. These young men have revealed some attitudes that I suspect are not unique to them, and this might be an opportunity to address those attitudes in a constructive way." Patterson looked surprised by the suggestion, but nodded for her to continue. "Cadets," Sarah said, turning to address Marcus, Derek, and Tony directly, "you've spent the evening lecturing me about military values and hierarchy. Now that you know my rank and background, I'm curious whether your opinions about those topics have changed." Marcus finally found his voice, though it shook with nervousness. "General, we had no idea who you were if we had known." "That's exactly my point," Sarah interrupted. "Your behavior was based entirely on assumptions about who you thought I was rather than any actual knowledge of my qualifications or experience. Does that strike you as consistent with the military values you claim to champion?" The question forced all three cadets to confront the fundamental flaw in their thinking. They had spent the evening arguing that military promotion should be based on merit rather than politics or demographics, while simultaneously making judgments about Sarah based solely on her appearance rather than her actual merit. Derek, who had always prided himself on his analytical abilities, was the first to grasp the full irony of their situation. "We were doing exactly what we accused others of doing," he said quietly, "making judgments based on assumptions rather than facts." "That's right," Sarah confirmed. "You assumed that because I'm an Asian woman in civilian clothes, I must be unqualified for whatever position I held. You never asked about my background, my experience, or my achievements. You simply decided that I didn't belong and that it was your job to put me in my place." Marcus felt a flush of shame wash over him as he realized how completely wrong he had been. "General, I apologize. We were completely out of line." "The apology is noted," Sarah replied, "but I'm more interested in whether you understand why you were out of line. It's not just because you threatened a superior officer. The problem is deeper than that." "What do you mean?" Tony asked, though he seemed afraid to hear the answer. "The problem is that you believe your assumptions are more reliable than facts," Sarah explained. "You saw someone who didn't fit your preconceived notion of what a military leader should look like, and you decided that person must be unqualified. That kind of thinking makes you ineffective as officers and dangerous as leaders." The crowd around them had been listening to this exchange with fascination. Many of the junior officers present were seeing a master class in leadership and conflict resolution, while some of the senior officers were taking mental notes about how to handle similar situations in the future. Brigadier General Patterson was particularly impressed by Sarah's approach. Rather than simply demanding punishment for the cadets' inappropriate behavior, she was using the incident as a teaching moment that could benefit everyone present. "General Chen raises an important point," Patterson said to the crowd. "How many of us have made similar assumptions about people based on superficial characteristics rather than actual qualifications? This incident should serve as a reminder that our judgments need to be based on facts rather than biases." Sarah nodded in agreement. The military is only as strong as its ability to identify and develop talent wherever it exists. When we let assumptions cloud our judgment, we waste human resources and weaken our overall effectiveness. Marcus, who was beginning to recover from his initial shock, raised his hand tentatively. "General, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Earlier tonight, you said you've encountered situations like this before. How often does this kind of thing happen to you?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "More often than it should, but less often than it used to. The military has made significant progress in addressing these issues, but clearly there's still work to be done." "How do you handle it?" Derek asked. "I mean, you stayed so calm throughout the whole confrontation. Weren't you angry?" "Anger would have been counterproductive," Sarah replied. "When someone is behaving inappropriately based on assumptions and biases, responding with emotion usually just reinforces their belief that they're right. It's more effective to remain calm and let them reveal their own flawed thinking." Tony, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke up. General, we completely disrespected you and everything you've accomplished. Why are you being so patient with us? Why aren't you demanding that we be court-martialed? It was a fair question, and Sarah took a moment to consider her answer. Because I believe in the possibility of growth and learning. You made serious mistakes tonight, but those mistakes came from ignorance and poor judgment rather than malice. People can learn from ignorance, but they have to want to learn. We do want to learn, Marcus said quickly. We want to understand how we got this so wrong. Sarah smiled slightly. That's a good start, but understanding how you got it wrong is only the first step. The harder part is changing the underlying attitudes that led to the mistakes in the first place. Captain Rodriguez, who had been listening to this exchange with growing admiration for Sarah's handling of the situation, stepped forward with a question of his own. General, if I may ask, what would you recommend as appropriate consequences for this incident? These cadets clearly need to face some form of disciplinary action. Sarah looked at each of the 3 cadets in turn, studying their faces as if trying to assess their potential for genuine change. I think the consequences should fit the nature of their mistakes, she said finally. They made judgments about military leadership based on assumptions rather than knowledge. Perhaps their consequence should be learning what real military leadership actually looks like. Patterson raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? I'll let you work out the specifics, Sarah replied. But I think these 3 would benefit from spending some time with officers who don't fit their preconceived notions of what military leaders should look like. Let them see firsthand what merit and accomplishment actually look like in practice. The suggestion was met with murmurs of approval from the crowd. It was a consequence that focused on education and growth rather than simple punishment, and it addressed the root cause of the problem rather than just its symptoms. Marcus, Derek, and Tony exchanged glances, each of them beginning to understand that they were being offered an opportunity for redemption rather than simply facing the end of their careers. 6 months later, Marcus Webb stood at attention in the briefing room at Fort Bragg, listening as Colonel Maria Santos outlined the upcoming joint training exercise with international allied forces. The confidence that had once characterized his demeanor had been replaced by something deeper and more genuine, a quiet respect born from actual experience rather than assumed superiority. The intervening months had been transformative for all 3 of the cadets involved in what had become known throughout the military as the promotion party incident. True to her word, General Chen had worked with Brigadier General Patterson to design consequences that focused on education rather than punishment. Marcus had spent 3 months working directly under Colonel Santos, a Mexican-American officer whose tactical brilliance and leadership skills had earned her the respect of everyone who served with her. In his first week under her command, Marcus had witnessed Santos devise a training strategy that solved a logistics problem that had stumped the base's senior staff for months. Derek Morrison was currently stationed at a forward operating base in Eastern Europe, serving as aide-de-camp to Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Park, a Korean-American officer whose expertise in cyber warfare had made her one of the military's most valuable assets in an increasingly digital world. Derek had quickly discovered that Park's strategic thinking far exceeded anything he had encountered in his academic studies. Tony Rixai had been assigned to work with Sergeant Major Elena Rodriguez, a Puerto Rican woman who had risen through the enlisted ranks to become one of the most respected non-commissioned officers in the Army. Under Rodriguez's guidance, Tony had learned that real leadership had nothing to do with volume or aggression, and everything to do with earning trust and respect through consistent performance. The 3 men had maintained contact throughout their assignments, sharing their experiences and discussing how dramatically their perspectives had changed. The arrogance and entitlement that had characterized their behavior at the promotion party had been gradually replaced by genuine humility and a deeper understanding of what military service actually meant. Now, as Marcus listened to Colonel Santos brief the upcoming exercise, he found himself thinking back to that night 6 months ago and marveling at how wrong his assumptions had been. The woman he had dismissed as unqualified was now explaining complex tactical maneuvers with a clarity and depth of knowledge that left him genuinely impressed. After the briefing concluded, Marcus approached Colonel Santos with a question about one of the operational details. Their conversation was professional and respectful, a far cry from the condescending attitude he had once displayed toward female officers. "Colonel," Marcus said as their discussion wound down, "can I ask you something personal?" Santos raised an eyebrow. "Shoot." 6 months ago, I would have looked at you and made assumptions about your qualifications based on your gender and ethnicity. I'm ashamed to admit that, but it's true. How do you deal with officers who still think that way? Santos considered the question carefully. The same way General Chen dealt with you, I imagine. I let my work speak for itself and try to help people learn when they're open to it. Some people figure it out quickly, others take longer, and some never get there. But you can't let other people's ignorance stop you from doing your job. It must get frustrating, Marcus said. Sometimes, Santos admitted. But I've found that most people are capable of growth if they're given the right opportunities and incentives. Your case is proof of that. Marcus nodded, though he still struggled with guilt over his past behavior. I keep thinking about how badly we treated General Chen that night. She had every right to end our careers, but instead she chose to help us learn. I don't understand why. Maybe that's why she's a general and you're still a lieutenant, Santos replied with a slight smile. The ability to see potential where others see problems is one of the marks of exceptional leadership. That evening, Marcus video called Derek and Tony for their weekly check-in. The three men had instituted the calls as a way to stay connected and continue processing their experiences throughout their respective assignments. "How are things going with Lieutenant Colonel Park?" Marcus asked Derek, whose feed was coming from a base somewhere in Poland. "Incredible," Derek replied, though he looked tired. "We've been working on a cybersecurity protocol that could revolutionize how we protect military communications. Her understanding of both the technical and strategic aspects is beyond anything I've ever encountered." "What about you, Tony?" Marcus asked. "How's Sergeant Major Rodriguez?" Tony's face appeared on the screen from a training facility in Georgia, where he was working with new recruits. "She's taught me more about real leadership in 6 months than I learned in 4 years at the academy," he said. "I used to think leadership was about being the loudest person in the room. Now I understand it's about being the most reliable." "I keep thinking about that night," Derek said, echoing Marcus's earlier conversation with Colonel Santos. "The irony is that we spent the whole evening talking about merit and qualifications while demonstrating that we didn't actually understand what those things meant. The worst part is how many people were watching," Tony added. "We didn't just embarrass ourselves, we embarrassed the academy and everyone who had invested in our training." Marcus nodded grimly. "I ran into Captain Rodriguez last week. He told me that the incident has become part of the leadership curriculum at Fort Henderson. They're using our behavior as an example of how not to assess people and situations." "Good," Derek said firmly. "If our stupidity can help other people avoid making the same mistakes, then maybe something positive came out of it." The conversation was interrupted by an alert on Derek's computer. "Sorry, guys, I've got to go. We're dealing with a potential security breach that requires immediate attention." As Derek signed off to handle his emergency, Marcus and Tony continued their conversation. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if General Chen hadn't been so patient with us?" Tony asked. "Every day," Marcus replied. "We could have been court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, and had our lives completely ruined. Instead, we got the chance to learn and grow. I still don't understand why she chose to help us instead of destroying us." "Maybe that's the difference between being a leader and just being in charge," Tony suggested. "Real leaders build people up even when those people don't deserve it." Their conversation was cut short by an incoming call that Marcus had to take from Colonel Santos. As he signed off, Tony was left alone with his thoughts about the journey they had all been on since that night at the promotion party. 3 weeks later, the three men found themselves reunited at Fort Leavenworth for an advanced leadership seminar. It was the first time they had been in the same place since the incident, and the reunion was both joyful and somewhat awkward as they each processed how much they had changed. On the final day of the seminar, they received word that General Chen would be delivering the closing address to the participants. All three men felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness at the prospect of seeing her again. Sarah Chen took the stage in the main auditorium looking exactly as composed and confident as she had that night at the promotion party. Her remarks focused on the importance of continuous learning and growth throughout a military career, but Marcus, Derek, and Tony couldn't help feeling like some of her comments were directed specifically at them. "The military is an institution built on learning from mistakes," she said during her presentation. "The officers who succeed are not those who never make errors in judgment, but those who are willing to acknowledge their mistakes and grow from them." After her presentation, the three men approached the stage, uncertain whether she would remember them or want to speak with them. "General Chen," Marcus said nervously, "we're not sure if you remember us from—" "Of course I remember you," Sarah interrupted with a slight smile. "How have your assignments been going?" For the next 20 minutes, the three men updated her on their experiences over the past 6 months. They spoke about the officers they had worked with, the lessons they had learned, and how dramatically their perspectives had changed. Sarah listened with interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering occasional observations. It was clear that she had been following their progress through official channels and was pleased with their development. "I have to ask," Derek said toward the end of their conversation, "why did you help us instead of ending our careers? We treated you terribly, and we deserved whatever consequences you chose to impose." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "Because I believed you were capable of being better than you were that night. Punishment might have satisfied a sense of justice, but it wouldn't have created better officers. Education and experience can do that if the person is willing to learn." "We are willing to learn," Tony said earnestly, "but I'm not sure we'll ever fully make up for how we behaved." "You don't need to make up for it," Sarah replied. "You need to make sure it never happens again and that you help others avoid making the same mistakes. That's how real change happens in any organization." Marcus looked thoughtful. "Is that why you chose the assignments you did for us, to show us what real merit and leadership actually look like?" "Partly," Sarah admitted, "but also because I wanted you to work with officers who had faced the same kinds of assumptions and biases that you were expressing that night. I thought you might learn something from seeing how they had succeeded despite those obstacles." "We learned more than something," Derek said. "We learned everything we should have known before we ever put on the uniform." As their conversation wound down, Sarah offered one final piece of advice. "The measure of an officer is not whether they make mistakes, but how they respond to those mistakes. You've responded well to yours. Now the question is what you do with what you've learned." 6 months after that reunion, Marcus Webb received orders for his first independent command, a platoon of newly graduated lieutenants at a training facility in Texas. As he prepared for the assignment, he thought constantly about the responsibility of shaping young officers and ensuring they didn't repeat his mistakes. Derek Morrison had been selected for an advanced cybersecurity program that would eventually lead to a position at the Pentagon, working on classified projects that would help protect American military communications worldwide. His experience with Lieutenant Colonel Park had opened doors he never could have imagined. Tony Rixai had been recommended for promotion and was being considered for a position in military personnel development, where his experience with transformative leadership would be valuable in training other non-commissioned officers. All three men had not only recovered from their near-career-ending mistakes, but had used the experience as a foundation for exceptional growth and service. On a warm evening in May, exactly 1 year after the promotion party incident, Marcus found himself at another military social event. This time, he noticed a young lieutenant making dismissive comments about a senior enlisted woman who was attending the function in civilian clothes. Without hesitation, Marcus walked over to the lieutenant and gently suggested they have a private conversation. Over the next hour, he shared his own story about the dangers of making assumptions about people based on appearance, and helped the young officer understand why his attitude was both wrong and professionally dangerous. Later that evening, Marcus called Derek and Tony to tell them about the encounter. "It felt like completing a circle," he explained to his friends. "A year ago, we were the ones making those mistakes. Tonight, I was able to help someone else avoid them." "General Chen was right," Derek replied. "The real measure isn't whether we made mistakes, but what we did with what we learned from them. And whether we can help others learn the same lessons without having to make the same mistakes," Tony added. As they ended their call that night, all three men reflected on the journey they had taken from arrogant cadets to thoughtful leaders. The woman they had tried to humiliate had instead given them the gift of wisdom, and they were determined to spend their careers proving worthy of that gift. General Sarah Chen, meanwhile, continued her distinguished service, secure in the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is plant seeds of growth in fertile ground, even when that ground initially appears hostile. The three cadets who had once threatened her had become living proof that people can change, learn, and grow when given the right opportunities and guidance. The incident that could have been a simple story of justice and consequences had instead become something much more valuable, a testament to the transformative power of patient leadership and the endless potential for human growth. In a military that depended on learning, adaptation, and continuous improvement, there could be no more important lesson than that.